tailbone and the sacrum, we've got this connection to the unicellular consciousness and how we fall from paradise. And how you can actually reconnect that paradise just by working on these energy gates around the tailbone, around the sacrum, and around C1 and C2. That's one thing that we're going to be discussing and exploring, and even exploring the deep meaning of the names of the acupuncture points in these zones, right? So when you get up to the level of the sacrum and the lumbar spine, you're dealing with the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system. And this is, it's called the autonomic nervous system because it's operating underneath the threshold of your normal consciousness. It's a primitive system, in a way, that is regulating how you respond to things in terms of, do you go into fight or flight, which is sympathetic nervous system dominance, or do you go into feed and breathe, which is parasympathetic nervous system dominance? Normal human healthy functioning needs to be able to access both, right? What we find in our modern culture is that people go into sympathetic dominance, which is fight or flight, for tremendously long periods of time. And this is very different than animals or indigenous human beings, actually. And we can, let's just briefly explore some of the origins of that a little bit. If you're an animal, and you can observe this in deer, for example, if you're a deer and you get chased by a mountain lion in this area, what happens is you run like hell, and you've got an 80% chance of making it. Because mountain lions are only successful, I think, 1 in 5 or even less times that they try to catch a deer. So if you observe a deer after it's being chased by a predator, what it will do is it will, obviously run like heck to escape and be very, very observant for a while till it's sure that it's gotten away. And then it will pause and it will let itself shake. It will start shaking its body. What it's doing with that shaking is it's releasing the physically stored energy from the vast release of adrenaline that occurred as a result of the fear, right? The deer is in body-identified consciousness, just like every animal that's higher than an insect, and it's just dealt with a threat to its identification of itself as its body, and it's released a lot of adrenaline to get its body moving really fast and to activate everything. Now, of course, that had to shut down its emotional processing to some large extent. It had to shut down its digestive system to a very large extent, and shunt different things in different ways so that all the blood could flow straight to the muscles and get the animal moving really fast, and also to its brain, to its eyes and its ears, so its perception is really fast. And then it shakes like crazy, and it releases that physical stored kinetic energy, and then it's calm. And you can watch a deer not long after it's just been through a really scary situation. No, it's munching on the grass, and its ears are, of course, keeping an eye out on things, and its eyes, but it's like chill, right? Then let's look at indigenous people. People who still live a hunter-gatherer lifestyle, and there's barely any of them left on the planet. There's the Hunza, there's the Warani, there's a few, very few. There's some Bushmen, Bushmen, and so on. If you watch how they live, this is like an example of evolutionarily what you did, how you originally functioned, not that long ago, a few thousand years ago for almost all of us. This is taken from the life of the San Bushman. You're sitting around the campfire, and people are starting to get hungry. If you're a man, typically, and so you haven't caught any meat in 4 or 5 days or a week or so, and so it's time to go out on a hunt. So you get up early, you got all your tools prepared, a few days before. And you get up early and you start moving really fast through the bush. Maybe at a little kind of trot, a jog, maybe at a fast walk until you spot the prey. And then you start moving faster. But you're chasing big animals that move really fast over long ranges. Because you want to be able to get a big animal so you can feed the village for a week or two. at least for a week. And so very often you run 50 miles in a day. That was normal for indigenous people, to run 50 miles in a day, right? What we now consider to be ultra-marathon lunacy, that's just what they did once or twice a week. You run 30, 40, 50 miles, because once you hit the animal, it doesn't die right away, normally. You've got to track its spoor for another 10 or 20 miles whilst it's bleeding out and slowing down. And then you catch up with it and you finish it off. And then you've got to butcher it, you know, throw all its meat and its skin over your shoulders, and then you've got to run back to the village. So then you run, but you're running back to the village because people are hungry and it's 20 miles away, right? So you've got to get back there. So you run back to the village, and then when you get back to the village, everyone is like so happy that the first thing they do is they start throwing the meat on the fire and cooking it, because they haven't had good protein. They've been eating nuts and berries and seeds, but hey, you know, after a week of doing that, believe me, you're going to want a steak. So then they throw the meat on the fire, and then they eat, and they dance. You dance all night, like all night, all night. Part of that dancing is this process of self-regulating, auto-regulating the sympathetic nervous system dominance of having gone out on a hunt and run 50 miles and maybe jumped over scorpions, narrowly missed a snake, avoided getting gored by some animal. You know, it was intense. It was an intense experience. And then after you've danced all night and you've just absolutely filled your stomach, oh, so good, you sleep for a couple of days. I mean, a lot for a couple of days. You just kick around, relax, you sleep, you sharpen your tools, go back to sleep. Right? This is actually very self-regulating for the nervous system. Let us compare and contrast that with modern life. So, in modern life, before you go to bed, or maybe you get home from work or something and you're relaxing, but there's some mail sitting waiting for you. And there's bills in the mail. Right there, right there. Your sympathetic nervous system immediately dominates. Your adrenals release adrenaline. The adrenaline needs 200 milligrams of calcium in your bloodstream now in order to speed up the rate at which the nerves can polarize, depolarize, and repolarize. Right? Boom, you need calcium. Do you have the extra calcium, given that the food for the last 50 years has been demineralized in this area? Probably not. So what you do is you hit a cup of coffee, because coffee causes your bones to release a couple hundred milligrams of calcium so that your nervous system can depolarize, repolarize faster, right? You're agitated, but you got to go to bed. So, you know, you go to bed, you get up from a loud sound in your ear, and you start your day, and you're actually in a state of chronic adrenal activation. And maybe you have a stressful day. Maybe you get a call from your kid's school that your kid didn't show up for some class, and then you've got these taxes due, and your car's making a funny noise, and somebody cut you off in traffic. It all is evoking your sympathetic nervous system, your adrenaline response, but it's really hard to resolve, right? How do you resolve your tax bill? Not in one day of running, followed by dancing, followed by sleeping. Actually, that's how I try to resolve mine, but anyway. Not really. You resolve your tax bill through some horrible mental process and sitting down writing crap and worrying and so on. And all this worry and stress and weirdness and the speed with which things are moving activates your sympathetic nervous system, but not your parasympathetic nervous system. And so everybody is chronically adrenally exhausted, which means, let's break it down further from a Chinese medical point of view. What that means is that everybody in our society is kind of in a chronic state of fear. Right? So if you're in a chronic state of fear, the only relaxing things are violent movies. Right? You're in a chronic state of fear for 4 or 5 days. Underlying, what people call stress, what they really actually mean is fear. I'm stressed out because of this, because of that, because of this, because of that. Cut it down, get it down, and it will be fear. You can ask people, are you afraid? I mean, no, I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid of anything, But they are, chronically and continuously. And so there was an interesting study done by, I think it was John Sarno. John Sarno was, I think he's an orthopedic surgeon who was interested in back pain. He was studying back pain. And he made a connection. He realized that when people, and he was working with men, I don't know why he was working with men, he was working a lot with men. He realized that when men have chronic back pain, they all seem to be worried about money. And so he designed some whole big study where what he did was he had men who had chronic back pain, very disabling back pain. They sat around in a circle and they talked about their issues about money. And at the end of 10 or 12 sessions of doing that, he evaluated their back pain. What he found out was that this was the most effective intervention for back pain that had ever been studied. Freaky, right? So the back pain was being generated from the chronic state of, well, fear, but nobody was calling it that because we're men, right? Men aren't meant to be afraid. This chronic state of adrenal activation and stress activation. Now, money for us is just the energy of nature. When somebody says money, it's just code for life supporting me. And when people think about money, then they fairly rapidly start thinking about living in a cardboard box under a bridge. And, and it's actually about survival. It's about the energy of nature, the survival energy of nature. But our method of encountering it and resolving it in our modern society is such that we don't. We don't and cannot seem to encounter and resolve. So we remain in this constant state of stress activation, fear activation, which means that the kidneys are constantly fatigued. And the stress point for the kidneys is L5 and L4, typically. Why? Because the kidneys aren't there. The kidneys are up at like T12 and T11 and L1. You know, they're not down at L5. Your kidneys aren't down at L5. Deep breath, Adam.